were kind of, doing this on the side where we would like mentor people like outside of, sort of work hours, like as a volunteering thing. And a few months ago, we started chatting and we were like, let's make this a thing. Like, let's, sort of scale the system here. So I'm like super glad that, UX Coffee Hours has grown to sort of, what it is now, and excited to be chatting with you all today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. So the first question that I have, just to get the session started, and I feel it's very much on topic, and maybe Anuj, you can take this first, is how did you land your first UX research job? What is the story?
Yeah, the story is a long one. I'll summarize it in a nutshell. My background is in HCI, computer science. That was my PhD. I graduated in 2013 from Berkeley. And my first job was actually a software engineer job at GE Research. So I was an engineer for them. And I like to describe it as I was intellectually occupied in that job, but I wasn't intellectually challenged. So like a couple of years in, I started looking for something else that maybe aligns more with the HCI side of my background. I was, thinking of like, companies I could go work at, like what's like an experience I want to work on. And this is like 2014, 15-ish. And I ended up like one night, like taking a Uber ride in the city, my first Uber ride. And the entire experience was like amazing and seamless. And like, it solved just like such a true problem for me that I was like, this app is freaking amazing. I got to work here. And then I basically just continued to pester a friend who used to work there. He was an engineer, and Uber back then like didn't have a research team. And I continued to like ping this friend again and again and again. And I think over the course of a year, and then eventually he was like, fine, like we have a director of research here now. Like he's, recruiting, we have positions. And I tried for a job at Uber and I failed. I didn't get in. And then, so I was, looking for other UX jobs, continued interviewing, and then, just the stars aligned. Uber needed someone who had sort of HCI background, but was also technical, because they needed the first researcher on their data products team, which was a very like sort of, technical team. So as I said, like stars aligned, and then, the person I was talking to reached out back and they were like, hey, you're up for a chat. And I was like, well, I've been ready for a year. So we ended up, sort of chatting, went through the interview, got through, and that was my first job.
Thank you so much for sharing, Anuj. I love hearing people's stories, because I was telling Laith earlier this morning, there's no standard UX job story. Everyone has like super diverse experiences. So thank you for sharing that. And maybe Laith, you can share yours with us.
Yeah, like has just been said, I definitely have my own sort of unique path. I finished grad school with a degree in basically anthropology of music, which seems pretty far from the world of tech. And I have a lot of sympathy for folks in the job market now, because I finished up in December of 2008, right when the economy was falling apart and jobs were getting posted and taken down before they were hiring and all this kind of thing. So definitely had a lot of struggles. I did a little work in Washington, D.C. in some sort of applied research setting. And that's what made me feel like, hey, I really like being outside of the ivory tower. I like doing something that has an applied impact. But, the sort of bureaucracy of Washington, D.C. wasn't really my jam. So I was like, oh, maybe I'll try industry and sort of see how that goes. I probably applied for a good 300 places. I got 2 interviews, phone interviews. They were both folks that just randomly had heard of my field, ethnomusicology. I did a lot of cold calls, or like cold emails to folks just asking for informational interviews. So, I wish there'd been a UX Coffee Hours then, because those interviews were super helpful for me sort of learning the jargon and all that kind of stuff. And was able to sort of get my foot in the door at a consultancy in the Bay Area called Answer Lab. And then, that kind of, opened up some doors from there.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Laith. And I think you've sort of nicely also like led into the discussion topic for today, which is, we are in super unprecedented times. And like you said, like jobs are sort of being rescinded, internships are disappearing or have already disappeared. And people are sort of like lots of things, thoughts come to mind when looking for your first job during this time. And so with that, maybe you and Anuj can kick the discussion off on some of the questions we often get. And the first ones are just to get the discussion going is, I'm looking for a job, UX research job right now. How do I get to the interview stage and then on and on from there when it's, in the current environment?
Yeah, I think like similar to what, just to kick us off, I think similar to what Laith was just saying, like this is a very like high input, like low output process. Like, and that's not to demoralize everybody here on the call, but you gotta increase your leads at the start. Like that's the way I describe it. So like, as Laith said, he applied to like 300 positions and whatnot. Like I had a similar process, like when I was applying and actively looking, and whenever I've actually done that historically, I would like sort of go broad up front and like not try to be super duper picky, and then like try to, sort of see what leads like start to convert and, sort of, go with the process after that. And a couple of things on that is, I think there are two key pieces to sort of, finding a good, sort of fit or a job for you. One is, of course, skill, like duh. I mean, that's, our craft is, one of the things that we continuously need to like work on. And the other one is network. And I think, like that's the piece that doesn't get like talked about as much, but I think like the more people the more you sort of, get closer to opportunities, so like, coffee hours is like doing a part of this for you, but even outside of this, find ways to like connect with other folks in the field, like have a chat with them outside of your usual day-to-day. So getting to know more people at like various different places, like what it means to do research and like all these companies is also good to know, because if you're interviewing at a company, if you have some background knowledge on what it means to be a UX researcher there, like that already helps. So I think just like building your network, getting to know like what's the lay of the land, what is a typical like UX research job. Even UX research varies a lot from company to company. As someone who's jumped a few companies, I can attest to that fact. So I think just getting a sense of the network, continuing to sort of work on your skill and apply to as many places as you can. I think those three would be the tips from my side.
Yeah, I plus one all of that, of course. I'd also say that even pre-COVID, just to sort of be real with folks, there is a structural problem we face in the industry where there's just not a lot of great on-ramps into the industry. And, there's this funny dynamic where a lot of folks, a lot of companies, there's a tragedy of the commons situation here where everyone's sort of competing for the same mid to senior level talent and aren't necessarily opening up those sort of junior roles. I think some of the fear that some organizations have is they're going to hire someone, invest a lot in them, and then all of a sudden they become a valuable commodity after like a year, and they're going to jump ship and go to another company. But it's hard for like sort of that to any one organization to solve that in terms of like an industry-wide level. And at least I'm speaking for sort of the Silicon Valley kind of area. It might be a little different in some other regions. So just to sort of, it's not about you. If you're having some trouble sort of getting that first job, there are some sort of these sort of systemic things. But, I think that also gives you an opportunity with that mindset to kind of understand about like, okay, so, organizations are a little also scared about not having enough mentorship available for junior folks. So how can I show that I'm sort of like a self-starter? I'm someone that's going to be able to figure things out. Still someone that, will take, feedback and want to sort of grow and be mentored, but someone that can do a lot of things on their own as well, I think is sort of an important part of the equation, just because of that weird imbalance in the industry that we sort of need to work on.
And Sam, sorry to interrupt the flow here, but there's a question about like the live stream and folks having trouble like getting in. Did we take care of that?
Yeah, I have left a comment in here, and I'll follow up on that. Keep going. Thank you so much for like driving the conversation here.
Yeah, sounds good. Are there any like? Was there any follow up to the last question, or should we like continue going?
Yeah. So just to flag everyone, I know a few people joined a little later. Like if any of the stuff that Laith and Anuj are saying, y'all have follow ups, just post a question in the comments. I'm monitoring the comments. So we don't have any so far, so I think we can keep going. Just let me know if there are questions, and I'll follow up on that.
Yeah, I guess like the next topic that would be good to discuss between Laith and me would be, there's this usual question that we get in UX coffee hours, which is like, I want to be a full-time UX researcher. Like I don't have a ton of experience, but I can get experience up until I become one. So it's kind of like there's a cycle there. Like how do you how do you get the experience like without becoming one, and without experience you can't get one. So I wonder, Laith, if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's definitely there's a catch-22 there that I can definitely sympathize with. So for me, part of it is that idea of, can you show potential? If you if you're thinking about like data and there's only like 1 week of data, you can't extrapolate that as a predictive sort of line very far forward. So I think that's the challenge that a lot of folks have. So with that sort of metaphor, if there's any way that you can sort of create a longer track record, I think that can help people diagnose your trajectory. Now, some of that might not be research specific. You say, hey, I've done what I could to learn research in a sort of a simulated environment, but look at all these other areas of my life, whether it's sort of like self-education or other domains of your life. You can kind of show that you have this trajectory of sort of being able to sort of build yourself up. And then if there's anything you can do with research, and that could be doing some pro bono projects for a nonprofit or something like that. And then I think the other side of that is, to Anuj's point that he was talking about with his story, is sometimes your subject matter expertise. A lot of us are coming from other fields. So maybe you have a background in public health. Well, see if you can really get there there's a myriad of health tech startups. And so, they're saying like, oh, this person has so much subject matter expertise, they'll be able to parlay that. Or if you're really into video games, maybe you can sort of parlay that into something like that. So I don't know, those are some of my initial thoughts. What do you tell folks, Anuj?
Yeah, I mean, plus one to all that you said. I think the idea of like doing some pro bono work is a good one. I think just like being curious about the world, honestly, I think it's a cliche and it's like very simplistic of me, but honestly, yeah, I mean, if there's like a coffee shop next to you and, with COVID, they're trying to reimagine like what the ordering process looks like go help them, like go figure out, sort of how you can optimize the world to be a little bit better, because isn't that like what we do like in our daily lives? So like, like try and practice that. Like an idea that I've been thinking about is, with the fires and everything, I feel like I was getting information from like all different directions and there wasn't really like a proper like structure to it. So something that I've been trying to do as a side project is like, what would be an ideal experience of, me getting alerts or me getting information about, fire, and sort of, there are a couple of like good apps that do that, but there's not like one place I could go to where I could get like a holistic picture. So like think about what problems like exist in the world, and like go pursue them. And I think like that's, to Laith's point, like that's what interviewers are also like looking for. Like how much are you curious about like a particular space, and how far will you go just because you're curious and not because like someone is asking you to? I think that's like a pretty big signal, and that at least like me as a manager, like I look for. And there are like a couple of other things you could do. Like there are, of course, like meetups and like hackathons you could go to. When I was looking for UX research jobs, I remember going to this meetup. It was some consulting firm in San Francisco, and I'm like blanking out on the name, but they were trying to like redesign like existing apps for the Apple Watch, which was like an interesting problem. So like interestingly, I took on Uber as the app I would design for Apple Watch. This was not when I was working at Uber. And, it just like sparked a bunch of thoughts in my mind. I ended up meeting a lot of like really cool folks there, who still to this date continue to be my friends. So I think, yeah, again, like it goes to, so just building a network, trying to take on problems that are interesting to you, and then going from there.
And I love that idea of the coffee shop. So, I also teach a course at the UC Berkeley Extension. And, a lot of my students, I don't think would ever do the research on their own, but as soon as it's part of the class, all of a sudden they're able to find ways, because one of the assignments is to go do a usability study with 6 people, and they recruit 3 friends and 3 folks at a coffee shop, and they're able to do that. And I have them spend $20 on Mechanical Turk to get some survey respondents, and it's not a huge data set, but there's 100 people, and so they can actually crunch some real data and kind of go through that. So it's not super elegant, but at some companies explicitly sort of called out, they call it the growth mindset. And so, this is such a great example. If you can show that you have that growth mindset, you're willing to figure things out, you have that insatiable curiosity, that's a huge value.
We have a few questions on this. Clearly, this is of interest of people. So I'll just go in order. A few different questions have come up. They're all interesting. So Chaitanya asks, what would you suggest, working in the industry a year or actually going into a small company. So getting a job somewhere versus going and getting a degree and trying to get into like, maybe that makes you more marketable to a bigger company, more formal UX experience. So it's sort of like comparison there.
Let me see if I can attempt to answer this like, try and answer this first. Let's see. So degree versus industry experience, huh? I think a part of it is like personal. I think the question is personal because, there's no like one size fits all answer here. So it totally depends on, where your craft is and where you want to take it and like what do you want to add to what you already know, right? So if you feel like you have the craft, like enough skills, you can do sort of ethnography and like diary studies and sort of surveys and sort of some of the common methods that we usually use. All you're missing is like some industry experience. I'd say like go for the industry experience. If you feel like, oh, like I've worked for a little bit, but I don't really truly understand the theory of how all this works. Like I don't really know like what qualitative coding is and like how do I use that to surface insights. That could be something that you go, sort of get a degree in. And actually, like degree, I don't feel is like the final solution here. Like there are also classes you could take. There's general assembly. There's a variety of things you could do to like sort of build up experience like that. So I feel like even between sort of getting a job and like getting a degree, there are like a few steps in the middle that you could potentially take to see if like heading back to school is such a good idea for you.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, if you can get your foot in the door somewhere and get that experience, I've met folks that have like, top program HCI master's degrees and are still struggling to get their foot in the door. So if you have a door, I would suggest going through it. A lot of folks get that master's degree in HCI so that they can get that internship, which is really sort of the parlay. So, I think when I think about some of the best research that I've worked with, one I'm thinking of as a PhD in human-computer interaction, and another one started out on customer support. And one day her boss came up to her and put a book on her desk and said, "We need someone to do this kind of stuff." And that's kind of what launched her. And she doesn't have any advanced degrees, and she's one of the smartest, most talented researchers I've ever worked with. So, there really is a huge spectrum. And some folks love school. I'm a total nerd. Like I would just be a lifelong student if I could, if it would pay the bills. Other folks, they can't get out soon enough and they just want to get in the, real world. So very personal decision. I think that's a great way to put it, Anuj.
Yeah, thank you. And just a few more questions on this. And I think there's a few people who have this question. So I'll just summarize. Tiffany and Anjali both are asking, when you're looking for a UX researcher, and this could be just personal, Anuj and Laith, or also like even what you see in the industry, what are some skills that are good to have? Like what defines a good UX researcher?
I can jump in. One of the paradigms I've heard a lot at a few different companies, so sort of this T shape, right? So you want to have this sort of like broad set of skills that we kind of all share as a practitioner, and then we start to kind of develop these more sort of specializations. So I'd mentioned, I have a background in ethnography, Anuj has sort of a more technical background and is able to bring that to bear. So that's kind of our sort of vertical of the T, and then the sort of the broad T. So when I think about that broad T, there's a few buckets. Big one is communication skills. So visual, verbal, and written communication is 3 separate things. Make sure you're at least, comfortable with all of them and hopefully pretty good at least one of them. There's the core skills of, how do I, pick the right method for the right question. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, here's the thing we're trying to figure out, how do you translate that into a research question and then pick an appropriate, method to sort of try and address it? Then there's sort of the implementation of that, so how do I, write a non-leading questions in a survey, and how do I moderate and do follow-up questions, sort of the core research skills. And, there's a lot of information you can find online on how to do a diary study or whatever it might be. There's some of that just sort of like a stakeholder management, and sort of things like that. And then there's sort of another bucket of sort of knowing how to work with other functions. So how to communicate with a product manager, how to communicate with the designer, sort of understanding their jargon and their incentive structures and sort of things like that. There's probably a few more. Maybe I won't talk much longer. Anuj can sort of fill in, but sort of think about it as sort of like, what is your horizontal bar? And then, even as a junior person, maybe you're coming with some other skills, starting to think about what your vertical bar might be.
Yeah, I don't think I could add like a ton to that. I think that was such a good response. Yeah, I think that's like pretty spot on with like what you need. I think the only thing I would add is that, I worked at like smaller, Uber was like small-ish when I started. And I've worked at, sort of big companies. Like Facebook has a very well-defined sort of, UX research role. And I think like it varies a little bit across like smaller and bigger companies. I think like when you're at like a startup or like a small endeavor of some sort, you're kind of a researcher, but you're kind of like your cross-functional stakeholder yourself as well. Like you're doing a little bit of like data science, you're doing a little bit of like product management, you're also a researcher, and you're kind of like doing all those jobs. So like, and in fact, like if you could do that like early on in your career, it actually enables you to sort of be at a bigger company because you have an appreciation for like what all these cross-functional stakeholders do. So I think like another skill would be to like just like try everything you can. Like even if you're in a job, like don't be sort of bound by how UX research is like defined, because I think the more you can learn about like other disciplines as you do this, the more it will be helpful in the long run. That's the only thing I'll add.
Awesome. I think that was most of the questions. And there is another question, which I think will launch us into sort of the next subtopic area, which is there's a question from, let me get the name right here. Oh, I can't find it anymore, but I'll ask anyway. So there's a question about transitioning from academia into the industry. And I think we can just take the general subtopic to be like, you're not in UX research right now, and you're not in the industry, and you have to transition. How do you navigate that transition, and what are some good ways to do that?
Yeah, I think like some of the things we have talked about already like hold here. Sort of building your network, getting to know like what it means to do research in the industry is like that's always true, irrespective of where you're coming from. I think people who are coming in from academia, I mean, I came from academia. I like sort of graduated with a PhD and then like started looking for a job. And it was honestly like at that point, it was easier for me to like find a job that aligned more with what I had just like graduated from. So maybe like find like a jumping off point, right? So my first job wasn't really software engineering, but it wasn't really like a UX research job either. It was a research engineer job where I was kind of like doing everything. I was writing code, but then I was also evaluating the systems I was building. So it was, sort of helpful experience that then helped me get like a UXR job. So I think it's a little bit of like trying to understand what a UXR role is, where you are, and what's the diff between the two. And like trying to understand if there is like a intermediate step you need to take, or can you like directly go for a UXR job, maybe like try, doing that with a startup, like, or, sort of do something in the middle.
Yeah, and I the way I tend to think about it is like in a lot of ways this is a human-centered design challenge. In terms of how do you make yourself understandable to the person that's reviewing that application, and so a lot of this is a translation problem or challenge, not a problem. I'd seen in the chat someone had mentioned real estate. I don't know anything about real estate. My guess is if you've been working in real estate, there's a lot of skills that are relevant to the kind of work that we do, right? You have to go out there, you have to meet with people, you have to understand their needs, you have to sort of try and match, what's available with what's possible, and a lot of sort of management of folks and sort of things like that. If you're an academic, let's say that you were doing something in the academic social sciences, there's all these things that you're doing, but you're calling them a certain something. So it's translating both the jargon, sort of using the right nomenclature. In anthropology we say the shibboleth, sort of the insider way of talking about it, so it's instantly understandable. And then it's that translation. If you're working in customer support, if you're working in real estate, if you were working as a designer and now you want to become a researcher, how do you translate the work that you've done before into sort of the categories of things that researchers do? And so this is also a great way for you to kind of like humble brag a little, because you can talk about these things that you've done and explain how they're relevant to the work of a UX researcher. Now, of course, that's a little hard because you haven't worked as a researcher, so you don't know all the sort of the nitty gritty, but hopefully through, sort of the networking and all the blogs and videos and things available, you can kind of do your best approach to sort of try and do that translation work.
Awesome. I think most of the questions are sort of answered. yeah, maybe we can keep progressing through our like planned topics, and I can keep monitoring the questions if more things come up.
That sounds good. I think like the other topic that we wanted to talk about that also comes up regularly in sort of UX coffee hour chats is that like internships and jobs have kind of disappeared, and like some people are thinking about waiting a little bit till they look again. So like what can they do between now and maybe like interviewing later in the year, next year? Like what are some of the things that folks could be doing to sort of build up their experience? What do you think, Laith?
I'd like to hear your. I'm at a smaller company, and so we don't have as quite a robust an internship program where I'm at currently. I mean, I guess that would be one of my takeaways. Is it's oftentimes the larger companies that have really robust internship programs. Yeah. So I don't know, but I'd love to sort of hear how it's being handled at Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook. I mean, I think we might be one of the companies that are still like hiring and sort of we're still like recruiting interns for next year. So maybe that's what I would say, like try for next year. We have some positions open. I mean, of course, like the intern season for this year it's at the end now, so like there are not internships available anymore. But as we look into next year, that's something that Facebook is continuing to do. I think like there are a couple of other things that we've already touched on, but they're so important that I'm going to revisit them again. So I think if you do have time sort of between now and as and when you look for a job again, just continue to be like curious about the world, like go work on a project that's interesting to you, like take classes, get to meet a lot of people. Like if you've decided that you have some time, why not use that time to position yourself in the best way possible when you are actually on the job market? So I think some of the things we've already discussed, like just continue to do those, like connect with people, build on the skills, build on the craft, and then sort of go from there as and when you're ready.
And just because you made me think of this, I will encourage folks, assuming that we're getting back hopefully next summer to more of a normal internship schedule, some of those processes start maybe earlier than you expect. So I know some internships get posted as early as like late November or December, and by January and February, like a lot of the bigger companies are already there. So if you're thinking about an internship for next summer, it's almost about now that you want to start, getting your alerts set up and looking at all the pages and maybe checking every few weeks and sort of things like that. Occasionally there are a few places that have winter internships or winterns. And so you might want to also sort of look for those. I don't know how COVID is going to affect that, but I do see those posted every once in a while, but there's a lot fewer of them.
There's a bunch of questions, which I don't know if you want to do it right now or sort of bring it back towards the end of the session, but they're all around like portfolios and the hiring interview. So I don't know if you want to get into that right now or.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about it. It's important. Like the other thing I would, sort of flag here is that there's a video sort of interview that like Tejas and I did, like I think it was like a month ago or something, that was actually about like what like a on-site looks like, and like what's a portfolio, like how does it actually work, like what are some of the things you can do to optimize for that. So highly recommend people sort of go through that. There are other videos on like a similar topic as well. So like if you just go to sort of our stream, you will see some like good content there. The process honestly like varies a lot. I don't think I can like give like one answer here. Typically it includes like the number varies, but typically it includes kind of like a bunch of interviews even before you come on site. So like some kind of a video sort of screen process for every company, I would say. Typically at least one of those interviews is about like skills. So like you would generally work with like a sample problem and sort of try to solve it. On-sites are your standard kind of your presentation and then sort of chats with the folks who were in the presentation like through the day. Typically you talk to researchers and a mix of maybe like product managers, designers, like people you would be working with in your day-to-day. So I think going back to some of the points that Laith was mentioning earlier, sort of being able to like work with like a variety of different stakeholders, like always, helps. Like if you can talk about that experience, whenever you've done that in the past, like always helps in these interviews. Like that's like very roughly, that's typically the process. I can go into details of sort of, what each one of those is, but I'm not sure that's what folks are looking for. We kind of go through all that in the video that I think they just pinged onto the chat as well. So highly recommend people go through that as well.
Yeah, not much to add, because there is so much variety. And, just to underscore, because it brings up another topic for me, is that, it seems like there's this thing of UX research, but it's really like very different at different places, both the kind of company. So, if you're at a small startup and there's one researcher, it's going to be very different than if you're at, a big, tech company like Facebook or something. There's also some philosophical differences, some skew much more towards sort of the, kind of like HCI side, some are a little more into the like ethnographic side, some are a little bit more of a mix, sort of where, even something as like esoteric as sort of like the org chart, is research part of the design team? Is research reporting into product? Is there sort of like a central insights team where maybe you have data science and research and market research all together? Those all kind of have like different things, as well as sort of the general maturity of the research team and the general human-centered design maturity of the company. You apply to some companies and you can tell that they've approached applying to their company as a product, as a human-centered design experience, and it's very sort of effortless, and you like learn about the company and it's great. And other ones, and it feels very sort of like Byzantine, and you sort of have to fill out a million things and take little tests, and it's a very sort of different philosophy. And of course, there's regional differences. If you're applying for a company in Asia or in Europe or in the United States, there's some sort of different kind of differences. So you can learn a lot about a company and sort of where they are in terms of their sort of design maturity by sort of just going through that application process, as well as how folks are treating you. Some folks, it almost feels like the Inquisition and they're kind of grilling you. And other places, it feels like a much more kind of like friendly conversation. So you learn a lot about the company and the culture in that kind of process. Of course, the big caveat is that the much bigger companies, the culture can be quite different, on different teams, and so that's just yet another sort of added complexity to sort of trying to sort of sort through as well.
There's another really nice question that's tied to all this, and it's also got some plus ones from other folks. So Adwa, sorry if I'm butchering your name, she asks, can you talk about a really stellar research interview? I'd love to hear what stood out and drew you out to the different people that you hired, maybe like even if it's one story or a few different ones.
I can start on this one. For me, I'm trying to understand the thought process. So a lot of the interview process is talking about a research project that you did. And so, like any research process, there's a million decision points that are happening along the way. I get scared if I meet someone and it feels they're on automatic pilot, like, oh, I interviewed 6 people and that's just the way it's done. I want that person to have reflected and said, I talked to 6 people, but here's the rationale for it and sort of things like that. You might have approached that project entirely different than I did. But if you can articulate all your rationale for the decisions, that's awesome. Okay, now we can have a conversation. And so for me, the really fun interviews are when people are able to talk about, their decision points and their rationale and what they did and what they would have done differently and what didn't go well and what did go well, because it opens up this much more interesting conversation rather than me just kind of sitting there and, the candidate just sort of, talking on almost on automatic pilot about this very sort of cookie cutter approach of how they did things. One of the best interviews I attended was someone where a research project just went disastrously wrong. And I love that they sort of came in and they acknowledged that and they talked about all the things they learned along the way and what they would have done differently and sort of all the process. And it was just fun because like in that sort of portfolio, there's a few of us that are hearing that portfolio. It was just such a fun conversation. We were really able to get to know that person and how they overcame challenges and again, really understand their thought process. And so that even though things didn't go great, there was a reasoning behind everything. So I think that's really for me the goal of what I'm trying to get out and really impresses me is when people can kind of talk through those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think I concur. I think one of the, the question is about maybe like a stellar sort of interview that I have sat through. I think like there's one particular one that comes to mind. And I think the cool thing, and this relates to what Laith was saying actually, the cool thing about, that particular candidate as I'm thinking about them, was that they kind of like took like a framework to the research process, and they sort of talked through that upfront. They were like, here's how I think about research. And it wasn't to say that this is the process I apply to like every single problem that I get, but it was like a general framework for how they think about research. And then they took that, and then through the course of what they were presenting, they applied that at like various different companies they had been at. And it was just like interesting to see how they were allowing for flexibility when the environment changes. But they were able to like tie that back to like a high level understanding of like how research works, like how a question gets planned, like how a research study gets planned, like how you work with stakeholders to land the findings, how impact gets processed, like end to end, like how do you work on a research project. And it was just like such a cool way to sort of tie certain things that were almost like non-overlapping, but they were able to like tell a really good story around the entire, sort of, 2 or 3 projects that they were talking about. And it was like one of the most enjoyable presentations I've sat in.
I just add to that, you really encourage folks, and this is painful and it's not fun, but record yourself, get your smartphone, record yourself doing the presentation, and then watch it back. No one likes hearing their own voice back. I hate my own voice. We all, I do funny things with my hands sometimes when I'm presenting. It's good to be aware of those kind of things. And also just to sort of see where you're stumbling and like where you're kind of losing your attention. If you're losing your attention, that'll definitely show that the portfolios, kind of get that smoothness. And similarly, when I was going on the interview circuit, I would stand in front of a mirror and I'd say, all right, I know these questions are going to come, which is, tell me about yourself, or tell me about why you're interested in this company, and just sort of practice saying it in front of the mirror out loud, or practice saying it, recording it, and listening it back. You don't want to be too overly rehearsed. It's kind of nice if there's still a little spontaneity and sort of, a freshness to it. But, you could learn a lot by sort of seeing how you're doing these kinds of things and sort of where you're able to draw in the conversation and sort of things like that. The one other piece of advice is, if you're ever given like if you're presenting like an exercise, I would also encourage folks to be really upfront if you're making any assumptions. So if your assumption is that they didn't tell you how long in this sort of scenario you would have, say, okay, I'm assuming I'd have about 4 weeks. And I'm assuming that just for the sake of this exercise, I have unlimited budget, or, just really put those things on the table so that way, if they had different assumptions, it's sort of out there and that you can sort of focus on what you did versus what you didn't do.
Yeah, can I add one more thing? So, it's a very tactical advice, but honestly, like, do not sort of, do not like ignore the value of like a well-designed presentation, right? So, like, if you have a design, like, if you're anything like me, you're not great at design, right? So, like, I am really bad at sort of, being able to evaluate, sort of the aesthetics of the deck I've put together. I'm good at putting together the content that would go onto the deck. So like usually when I'm interviewing or sort of putting portfolio together, I actually like run it by like some designer friends of mine, and I'm like, hey, like give me feedback, like what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So how can we sort of clean this up? And I have like super tactical advice, but there is something great about just a very well sort of cleanly designed presentation that just like gets everybody's attention in the room. That's just like a very quick, like cheap way to get sort of everyone sort of looking at what you're presenting.
And get eyeballs on it. I mean, I have a friend right now who's a very senior researcher at a big tech company, and he sent me his portfolio because he's thinking about going on the job market. And I was like, this is the last person I assumed, he's done this a million times. When I was entering this world, I have a friend who does a nonprofit consulting, and so she does a lot of like presentations, and I sent it to her and she gave me a lot of feedback. I mean, just getting eyeballs and getting feedback is just so important. For just kind of that polish and clarity, and it doesn't have to be like a total work of art, but because I'm also design challenged, but every little bit of polish can really help, and it also just makes you a more polished presenter because it helps you take away the noise to make sure the story comes out, and again, really be able to sort of share your thought process. So maybe it's your aunt, maybe it's your cousin, but like get some eyeballs on it,
So I'm hearing get designer friends or people who are good at like design if you don't have them already. That's awesome. Great advice. I kind of like, maybe we have a lot of questions on portfolio, and we've touched on some of them, but more specifically, I think the conundrum or question that we always get, and even I've had them in my job hunt as UXR, is what is a UX researcher portfolio need to look like, right? And I think the question also comes from like we compare ourselves very closely to our design partners, and UX design portfolios are just you know what they are. They're beautiful, they're wonderful, and all of those things. And a lot of us don't have those design skills. So we often wonder, what does our portfolio need to look like? And when it's being evaluated, what do recruiters and hiring managers look for in those portfolios?
Yeah, I mean, this might be a little bit controversial. Let's see.
Hot takes.
Yeah, and I think I covered this in the YouTube video as well, the interview with Tejas. But I think portfolios don't matter as much upfront. I think what matters is the resume. Like, I'm trying to think of the times when I've like really gone through like a portfolio. Actually, like the person who's looking at your sort of application upfront is probably a recruiter. Like at least at bigger companies, that's the case. And the thing that they're going through like for 40 seconds is your resume. They might click on your portfolio, but most likely they won't. So I think if you had to make a trade-off and like work on one thing, like I would work on the resume first, like sort of clean that up. Portfolio, I think, becomes more and more important as you go deeper into the process. So I think that's the place where portfolio starts to matter. So like once you get your like first sort of interview, once you get your first foot in the door, that's the place where you start to discuss like what you've done in the past. And I think that's where portfolios come into the picture. And even when you sort of go on site, there's typically like a portfolio component associated with it. So I think like from a process perspective, that's how I would love folks to sort of think about it. It again like varies from company to company, but those are like my 2 cents up front.
Yeah, and just because I see the question here, someone had asked what we mean by portfolio. So portfolio is basically just a collection of a few projects that you talk through. Now, I'd also seen a question here about dealing with NDAs. Maybe you've done some freelance work or sort of things like that. So, when I'm looking at someone's portfolio, in a lot of ways, not to be too repetitive, the details matter a lot less. So if you can't show me the screenshot and you can just sort of talk very at a high level what the product was about or the space, this was for a health tech startup or a fintech startup or whatever, like I'm okay with that if you can just give me enough and talk me through the process and the challenges. So it's really about sort of being able to use it as a little bit of a case study. Typically, a portfolio might have anywhere between 2 and 4 examples, depending on sort of how big they are. Really good in advance to understand. Some folks, companies are going to have 30 minutes to present. Some it might be up to an hour. So you're going to have to sort of adjust how much content you have in there. And so it's really about walking through a few of these examples so that people can understand. I think it's great if within the portfolio you can have a little breadth. So I wouldn't do 3 usability studies. It's nice if you can do have some sort of compare and contrast to kind of show things. Maybe one was with a business to business product and one was on a consumer product, or one was more for exploring a new product space and one was for evaluating something right before launch. So, there's a lot of different dimensions, but being able to show some variety and sort of difference across them. Maybe we're working with different sets of stakeholders across the projects, but basically it's a way for you to sort of tell people a few stories. I'd also seen a comment in the chat about, does it always have to be digital? And I'd say no. If you have a really great example where, you helped your university come up with a better system for people going to the cafeteria, and that was signs and helping people get in lines and, the salad bar not getting blocked and helping people get to the salad bar who weren't going to the hot food bar or whatever it is, if you approach that like a user researcher might, and was able to kind of go out and get those insights and sort of change the system, that's perfectly valid. So, for the person that was talking about real estate, if you approach something like a user researcher, even if it wasn't a fully digital or even at all a digital experience, it's showing that you kind of have that toolkit that you can apply to a situation and sort of move it forward. So you can get creative and sort of draw from different parts of your life. Obviously, the further afield you go, the better your storytelling is going to have to be and the better your translation work. So it's nice if you have some contrast. Maybe if your main sort of superstar project is really kind of far afield, you can still go and do a usability test with 6 people just to kind of show that, you can kind of do both of those kind of things. But, there is some room to get creative in telling your story about the work that you've done.
I love that. And I think like in the past, the way at least like I've tried to set up my own like application packet is like I've tried to think of it as like a bite snack meal situation. So like it's almost like my resume is the bite. So like you get a sense of what I worked on, like there's some detail and you kind of get a summary, but you don't get like full detail. My portfolio is kind of, the snack, and you can sort of, go to it, you can sort of consume a little bit more. And when I come on site, you get the meal, right? So like I come in, I talk about, end to end, like what did I do? So I think thinking of, end to end, like what is your application packet looking like? And like, how are you bringing in the details and like what form? And whether or not there's a story to it is I think also an important thing to think about.
Awesome. We have another question. If on the discussion guide, I'm looking. Anjali asks, you touched upon it briefly. I think Laith, you did. How do you determine the design maturity in an organization? Are there any red flags to look out for when interviewing for UXR roles? So I think this is sort of flipping the coin from like being interviewed versus how do you interview the company that you're going to work for?
So yeah, which I love, you should definitely be ready to interview these companies. One of the best interviews I ever had was with a head of product who I super respect. And I got on the phone with him, it was early stages, and we did our introductions. And then he said, "You're the researcher, ask some questions." And I was like, oh, and so fortunately I'd done my research on the company and had some questions, but it definitely kind of made me scramble. So always make sure you come in with your questions. And I think that's a fair one. And this is also another one where I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. Some folks like going in places where they haven't done much research before, because every project you do is going to have such a huge impact. You're going to be able to kind of help you really kind of set the tone and bring this whole new sets of values. Other folks, it gets really exhausting. Some folks feel to justify why user research, or figure out how to sort of align to sort of existing processes, and you want to go somewhere. So I think in general for more junior folks, it's often better to go somewhere with a little more structure, where the path has been trailblazed before. But if you're really just trying to get your foot in the door, it's also kind of, especially in this environment, hard to be selective. But I think it's also a great question just to ask, and to be able to have that conversation as part of the interview process, so you know what you're getting into. So questions like that, and just like the culture of the company and all those kind of things are all good things. So I wouldn't say that they're sort of empirical red flags. They might be personal red flags, depending on sort of what you're looking for.
Yeah, I love that. And I think like some specific probing always helps, like asking questions like, like what's the best research project you've seen? I remember asking that of a GM I was talking to. So I was like, like what has research done for you that has been awesome? So I think like just being specific about, past examples of research that people have seen, like how is information shared? Like how does research like integrate itself into the process? Like all of those are like great things to probe for, because, folks might say one thing, but it might be like different in reality, right? Like that's just how, things work. So asking for like specific examples of like end to end, like how a research process worked, like is a good model for maybe how research is perceived at the company. Now you might be talking to a company that doesn't have research, or you might be the first researcher. And it actually might be an incredible opportunity for you to come, like sort of go join and sort of set up the discipline. And in those cases, I would look more at the like kind of how receptive your sort of first line of stakeholders would be to research. Like why do they want a researcher? And maybe that's a good question to ask. Like why research? Like why not some of the other understand functions? Like why the company need research is also like important to understand in cases like that.
Yeah, I love that. And it's such a different thing. If they haven't hired a researcher before, you ask them, why are you hiring a researcher and why now? And it's a very different answer if they say, oh, we've been using consultants and some of our designers have been doing research and it's been really getting, a lot of success and we just need to have someone who's doing it full time. Like, oh, that might be a really good situation. If they tell you like, oh, well, one of our board members told us that we should probably hire a researcher. You're like, oh, this might be walking into a situation where it's going to be like a little challenging. I think there's a great question here, because Anuj, you'd raised this about, there's sort of the adage that a lot of times, especially the recruiters and hiring managers spend, less than a minute looking at a resume. And I know you've looked at a lot of resumes. So if you're spending that 60 seconds or 40 seconds, what are the things that you're looking for that jump out to you?
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty easy framework I use. Like I think whenever I look at like anyone discussing any project, it's mostly about like a couple of things. Like what was the problem you were trying to solve? What was the method you used to solve the problem? And like what was the impact? Like what did it change? Like impact, honestly, like if I had to describe impact in one line, impact is something changed because you existed. So like you did this project, like so what? So I think like having those three components in however you describe the project is like always important to me. The other thing I'm looking for honestly in a resume is brevity. So if you're at a company like Facebook, you're probably interfacing with like all kinds of people. You're also interfacing with a lot of like execs and like senior level folks. They of course will not have the time to like sit through like a long presentation. They sometimes want a quick summary of what are the key insights. And I'm kind of looking for that signal in the resume as well. Like, can you surface the most important things that there were to know about a certain project, given sort of a short amount of space? So I think those are some like quick signals I look at.
Yeah. The more you put on, the less the person sees. It's one of these kind of funny counterintuitive things. So I often encourage folks to say, what are the three things you want me to take away? And I think, Anuj, you'd already talked about sort of that of make it a snack or sort of tease me a little. Like this isn't an exhaustive thing. This is can this spark a further conversation? So what are those three things that you want me to know? Maybe it's that qualitative interviews, you've done some project management, and you've done some international research. Those might be the three things. And then really understand how those are the, everything, not everything, but 90% of the things in there are just reinforcing those three main points. And then the other side of this is looking at the job description and sort of trying to carry over. This is especially good for the recruiters. A lot of times recruiters don't specialize in recruiting for UX research positions. And even if they do, a lot of times recruiters, change what their responsibilities are. So the person first getting their eyeballs might not know a lot about research or social sciences or anything. So, if there's a line in the job description about we want someone that can do X, Y, and Z, see if you can express that in your resume. And so if you're doing your three things and the points in the job description, there's not going to be a lot of additional room to put stuff, because to Anuj's point, like we want it to be really, crisp and brief and to the point and clear. So those are like the two most important things, at least when I'm looking at a resume, that you can hit are those kind of two buckets of things. And there's not a ton of room for a lot else.
Yeah. And actually, like I'll double down on that point a little bit. I think the point of surfacing the top things that are to know about you is actually a really good one, because when you think about like how a hiring process works for me, a manager, is that like I meet a recruiter and I tell them, here are the parameters that I kind of need from this person that I'm hiring for, right? Like this position that I'm hiring for, and it would typically be stuff that Laith said, like international experience, experience like working on ads or something, and like a couple of other things, right? And I think when the recruiter goes to resumes, that's what they're parsing your resume for. So if you've done a certain like domain or certain type of work in the past, that's really awesome to just like upfront like surface that in the resume. So I'm just gonna like double down on that point a little bit.
And it's actually worked in some candidates' favors, where I was like, oh, I think they're a good fit. And then because they didn't put everything in the resume, when I get them on the phone, I'm like, oh, wow, there's all these other things that they're really good at. So it's like you kind of don't want to give it all away up front, because then it seems like, there's even more sort of over the horizon, and that can play in your favor too. It's always a little bit of a thing. And I will say one of the frustrating things about the hiring process, just as a little empathy here, is there's not a lot of feedback, right? So if you send in your application, you don't know if you missed by an inch or a mile. And it's frustrating. And like, maybe one of you can start a startup that helps to solve this problem, so there's a better hiring process, because we need it. But just keep experimenting and keep iterating. I think that's the other thing. Like I said, I'd applied to like 300 places, and by the end, my applications looked nothing like the first dozen that I did. So just keep experimenting and trying different approaches.
Awesome. We're at our last and final minute, and I think we've addressed most of these questions. If you feel like a particular topic was not touched upon, there'll be more of these sessions where I'll definitely, like, I'm here and Courtney's here as well. We'll sort of like touch upon these in future topics. Just sort of as a final, ending note, there was a question posted on the LinkedIn chat, which I think is a great one, a little bit off topic, but I think it's still great to touch upon, is what do you think the focus of the UX research field will be in the next decade? super broad, but just would be interesting to hear from you and Laith.
I can take it, and I'll just put in the chat as well. I did a buddy of mine, Grace, and I put together a getting started in user research a guide with some different sections. So put that in there, find it useful. Hopefully some folks do. Yeah, I think that sort of to this really great question is, there's sort of a few areas. One is, new technology. So whether it's AR, VR, chatbots, no interfaces, all those kinds of things, being able to kind of understand some of those, I think is going to be an important skill set. As a field, we really know how to make an e-commerce checkout better. We don't necessarily have that same playbook for, some of these emerging technologies. So that's one area. I think the other area I've seen to really push is sort of thinking beyond, to the broader, a broader perspective. So, when Anuj and I were both at Uber, it's not just about what's going on the phone, but it's about wayfinding in the real world and connecting with someone and these sort of online, offline moments, and being able to do research in these broader and broader contexts. And I think a lot of businesses are starting to straddle this digital non-digital experience or multiple digital experience. You're doing the same thing on your laptop and your phone and a TV and a kiosk, and sort of understanding how to do all that. And then the other sort of breadth that I'm seeing is being able to just inspired more by service design, which is sort of thinking about sort of systems more holistically and sort of understanding a much broader sets of stakeholders that come into experiences and sort of things like that. So those are the areas where I'm trying to grow personally and grow my team, and that I think there's a lot of exciting potential. So yeah.
Yeah, I talked about brevity earlier in the call, so I'll try to be brief here. So I think in 10 years from now, I think we will lose. Here's my perspective. I think UXR might not continue to exist as a discipline. I think the direction that we would head into is insights. So I think I see a world where data science, UXR, market research, all these understand functions become one. And I think as we get sort of more data about people and build better models and sort of pair that with surveys and other things we could do, I could see all these disciplines getting close together and becoming one thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm writing down all the mental notes I need to work on for my resume. This was super helpful. Thank you, Anuj and Laith, for joining us on a Sunday morning and sharing all your infinite wisdom. Thank you everyone on the call who all of the technical challenges and bear with the many pings during the call. Really appreciate it. We'll try to make the recording available in a week or so for anyone who wasn't able to make it into the call. So do let them know. And yeah, happy Sunday or happy Monday based on where you're at. Yeah, thank you everyone.
I just want to take a few seconds. Sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to thank Courtney and Sam for organizing this today. Super helpful, and Anuj and Laith for sharing your wisdom, guys. This is extremely helpful to hear you guys talk about how to prepare well for a job search in this COVID regime. Thanks so much, and thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, team. This was awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Good luck, everyone.